Hello, this is the Fiction Nonfiction podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your Twitter feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Whitney Terrell, the author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
And I'm V.V. Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, author of the novel Love Marriage.
All right, so I have a factual story to tell you. I took our new Brittany, Carla Lulu, hunting for the first time yesterday.
And how did that go?
It was great as far as the hunting goes, right? Meaning we drove 2 hours, walked 5 hours, saw 2 coveys of quail. I got 2 shots and I hit 1 bird.
Okay, so I can totally see why hunting stories might need to be more frequently embellished. But what does that have to do with nonfiction in the age of no facts, which is the topic of our show for this episode?
All right, okay, because here's the story. Driving home, I was hunting on Fort Riley, which is like a couple hours west of Kansas City. My tire started losing pressure. I pull off the highway in McFarland, Kansas, near the cemetery. I've got a flat tire. My car doesn't have a spare. I'm trying to call tow trucks. 2 nuns in a minivan came to investigate or to like leave something at a grave in the cemetery, and then left without noticing that I was there, stranded by the roadside. I kept trying to call this guy Tui Miller, who I'd gone hunting with, who's in his late 70s, whose real name is Whitney Miller, the second, and thus Tui, and who might be one of the people that I might be named for because of my mom knew him in high school, and so maybe she got the name Whitney, which is how I got named Whitney. So except for the fact that Tui never answers his phone.
No, stop. First of all, you must be making shit up. Second of all, this is the banter part, so
that is all true, but it goes on forever.
We don't have time for all this detail. Plus, haven't you heard? Trump didn't lose the election. Vaccines have microchips embedded in them. Facts are not worth this kind of attention anymore, especially mundane facts about some nuns and a guy named Tui.
Which is why, fortunately, we have 2 authors who can talk to us about real facts and how to present them to people, and who may, in fact, believe that these so-called mundane facts are exactly what we need to be paying attention to in order to heal the Republic, or at least ourselves. In the second half of the show, we'll be talking to Brendan O'Meara, writer and host of the Creative Nonfiction podcast.
But first, we're thrilled to welcome novelist and essayist Claire Messud. Claire is the author of 6 works of fiction, including the New York Times bestsellers The Emperor's Children and The Burning Girl. She lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and she's here to talk to us about her book of essays, Kant's Little Prussian Head and Other Reasons Why I Write. Claire, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sugi. Thank you, Whitney. It's great to be here.
It's very nice to have you here. In the introduction to this essay collection, which I really enjoyed, speaking of the relationship between today's news and the great literature of the past, you write, "It's all already happened somewhere in some way. It's out there to be retrieved," which is basically the foundational concept of this podcast, which we say at the top of every show, that everything that you can find in your Twitter feed or in the evening news has already been written about somewhere. Could you elaborate?
Well, I certainly emotionally, right? The gamut of emotions has been experienced, but I think weirdly, literally, I mean, here we are in a pandemic, and it's not the first pandemic, and we can read Pale Horse, Pale Rider, or we can read Boccaccio's Decameron, or we can, I mean, there are lots of example. We can read Camus' The Plague, right? I mean,
I was thinking we're going to talk about Camus later, and I was thinking, well, he would be a good one to be reading.
Right. And he's a good one for this time. But I also, there are so many examples of that. And I joined, a publicspace.org has an ongoing series of book groups, but the first in the spring was Yoon Lee's War and Peace book group. And so I was rereading War and Peace in the middle of, in the sort of darkest days of March and April. And there are these scenes that you may recall where everybody's trying to flee Moscow. And it was at a time when people were trying to get out of New York City. And suddenly, having all the wealth in the world didn't matter. What you wanted was to get out of Moscow and get to some farm in the middle of nowhere to get away from the invaders. So in the Tolstoy, it's an army. In our case, it's been a virus, but the atmosphere and the circumstances are oddly resonant. And another one, I read Paul Valéry's essays, and he wrote in 1936 about how, which I feel, we should pay attention. He wrote in 1936, he said, the big problem we have now is that he was in his 60s at that point. He said, young people think that the older generations haven't lived or experienced anything because of the technology gap. Because the older people don't know about technology, younger people think they have nothing to say to them. And of course, I have teenage kids who think
I mean, my son says to me all the time, well, if I give him advice, he's like, well, Dad, you didn't have electricity growing up. He literally he doesn't really believe that, but he wants to constantly, he feels that it's okay to say like, yeah, you made fire outside. You didn't have indoor heating, that kind of thing. That's his view of my technology ability, even while I am better than him at some certain technology things, like remembering to charge my phone.
Good for you, because I feel like I lose on all front. Like I'm not better at any of it. So,
yeah. One of the through lines of this collection has to do with difficulty or impossibility of actually being factual about our experience. Speaking of the technology gap and the internet. And so this is really at the heart of your collection's title essay, Kant's Little Prussian Head. And I wondered if you would read to us from that essay to start us off.
Sure. So this essay, which is, as you said, the title essay, is about how I feel that the Beckett line, we can't go on, we must go on, or the Beckett line, fail again, fail better, are sort of at the center of what I was trying to get at here. But I will start, the section I'm going to read involves quoting Thomas Bernhardt, who was a super crabby Austrian writer who died in 1989. As Thomas Bernhardt's scathing narrator recalls in his brilliant novel, The Loser, while reflecting upon his friendship with the pianist Glenn Gould, who is, needless to say, the narrator's figment, a version of the genius that only partially resembles the man himself, but that's another story. Anyway, the narrator recalls Glenn saying, "Fundamentally, we are capable of everything. Equally fundamentally, we fail at everything," he said, I thought. "Our great philosophers, our greatest poets, shrivel down to a single successful sentence," he said, I thought. "That's the truth. Often we remember only a so-called philosophical hue," he said, I thought. "We study a monumental work, for example, Kant's work, and in time it shrivels down to Kant's little East Prussian head and to a thoroughly amorphous world of night and fog, which winds up in the same state of helplessness as all the others," he said, I thought. A good friend of mine, a philosopher and a Kant scholar, has devoted the past 20 years to interpreting passages of Kant's Critique of Judgment. It is but one of the briefer texts in Kant's monumental work, and yet in order properly and thoroughly to understand it, she has committed all of her adult life thus far and considers her labor far from complete. For almost all of us, such serious focus on Kant's thought is impossible. For most of us, if we apprehend even a so-called philosophical hue, we consider ourselves in pretty good shape. It's like the dizzying enormousness of the cosmos in reverse. If, in order properly to understand a paragraph of Kant, one would need to engage in a lifetime of study, what are we to make of the entire breadth of his oeuvre, the observable universe of his oeuvre, if you will? And what, beyond that, are we to make of the fact that Kant's published writings represent already a careful ordering and editing and articulation into intelligible language of his philosophy, of his conscious thought? And beyond that, given that his thought arose in part from his experience all but entirely lost to us, made up of countless minutes and hours and days and years of life upon this planet, of Kant's individual and particular life, how are we to conceive of the unknowable vastness that was Kant? And further, if Kant is just one philosopher among thousands, just one German among millions, just one man among billions, how can we conceive of the entirety of uncommunicated and incommunicable human experience? What infinite, invisible universe of Bernhardian night and fog is this in which we must drift, the great genius Kant, according to Bernhardt, in the same state of helplessness as all the others? Thomas Bernhardt was a writer who took the dark view. The shrinking of Kant's mind, the breadth of his interests and wisdom down to his little East Prussian head does seem like a loss. But maybe, too, it's like the freeze-dried vegetables in packet soup, merely awaiting water for reconstitution. In contradiction to Bernhardt's darkness, I'll offer a quotation from a 1980s British film, The Long Good Friday, in which the gangster Harold Shand, brilliantly played by the late Bob Hoskins, gives a speech at a party on his yacht in the Thames, welcoming the American mafia to London to collaborate on some white-collar crime in the East End. Hands across the ocean, he says in his Cockney growl, bullish and optimistic. Hands across the ocean. Because, of course, Bernhardt is absolutely right. Of so much of our lives, we retain but a so-called hue, philosophical or not. But to convey what Bernhardt laments as a single successful sentence, that, I firmly believe, is cause for celebration. Even a single successful sentence can be transformative, and a single poem or novel can alter someone's life forever. That is Hands Across the Ocean. And it's a meeting that happens, if not only, then most fully, through language. With words, we can travel across nations and through time. We can inhabit lives far from our own.
Thank you very much. That's really good. There's a positive ending to that passage, but I want to go back to the part about this idea of reducing Kant's entire life and thought, or anyone's life and thought, down to a few key sentences. Today you hear people talk about the arguments for and against the use of facts, right? That surely the right side is to be in favor of facts and the wrong side is to be against facts, which as the side I'm against the use of non-facts. But when you ask, how can we conceive of the entirety of uncommunicated and incommunicable human experience, you seem to be suggesting kind of a different equation, which is really interesting to me, that the problem isn't lack of facts, it's that we have too many facts.
It's certainly true. We have too many. I mean, we now, I think there's so much attaches to that. And one thing is, of course, that we're now bombarded with facts and with information, or with non-facts, but we're just bombarded because of technology in ways that we historically weren't. It was just much harder to get information if you had to, sit down and read a newspaper, or go out and meet people in the town square. It was rather than your phone sort of pouring information to you nonstop. That there's that whole thing about the number of images that we take in, or that we see in a single day, that is more than people used to see in a lifetime, I think. There are too many facts, but I think that one of the things that writing can do is curate those facts in a productive way, right? I have a friend who's a physicist, and her project is at CERN, that vast super collider in Switzerland, and you can't observe the trajectory of a quark, but what you can do is measure at certain points, and so then you can project what that trajectory is. There's no way you can catch it the whole way around, but you can, if you strategically and wisely choose the points that you record, you can extrapolate what its actual trajectory is. And I feel as writers, that's what our job is strategically to choose the points so that your reader can infer the trajectory.
So maybe part of our job of developing a voice is thinking about how we developing principles for picking those spots.
Totally. I feel like, I try to explain to my students that those are political choices, right? I mean, I think one of the things that's hard when you're starting out writing and you're young is you think, oh, if I believe in, the good of such and so, I need to portray this person only the good things about this person. But of course, when a character in a story has only positive attributes, they don't feel real, because human beings don't only have positive attributes, right? Like we're all a mix of light and dark. And so I try to explain that actually to choose, you want to choose the details that give the complexity of something, but also the vision of that person that you hope to convey in its fullness, right? In its three-dimensionality.
I don't know if this has been a case for either one of you, since we all teach, but I recently taught a few books that had like complicated characters. I think I taught Russell Banks' Continental Drift, and I taught N.W. by Zadie Smith, and I taught Another Country by James Baldwin, all of which have like really unpleasant characters in them who do bad things and cheat on their spouses and all kinds of stuff. And of course, this all came up with The Burning Girl, right? Your novel like had a lot of discussion about what is a good and bad character supposed to be like. And they were really intolerant of characters who did anything bad. And I was like, well, what are you going to write about then? I mean, well, how is this going to work for you? Do you not understand that characters who do things that are bad are more interesting? And so I found that interesting. I don't know if that's an issue that you have with your students, or are they more...
Yeah, no, I think I feel as though that it's an interesting Puritanism, right? That they want characters to be exemplary, like to have flawless lives in ways that they themselves don't have, and their friends don't have, and their families don't have, right? But they sort of want. It's an interesting desire to want your fictional characters to be. It's actually sort of like Aristotle, right? Didn't he say that, that's why you were only supposed to have, kings and princes, is because they were supposed to be better than the common run of people. And then tragedy was, if they fell from high, then the tragedy was all the greater.
I wonder how much of that is sort of a struggle with like recently conversations becoming more sophisticated with regards to race, and people thinking about, for example, like the overrepresentation of narratives of people of color sort of suffering, and then sort of a desire to render onto the page people sort of resisting that and with like lives that are very happy. And then, as you say, like the problem sort of behind that isn't very complex and also isn't that realistic, or isn't really a particular testament to those communities, even though like sort of the depiction of joy in those contexts is important. I think that, yeah, watching people want, and then there's also sort of the desire among my students anyway, for people to be critical in ways they haven't in the past. So they're also really interested in, and they're often, I mean, they're so right a lot of the time. They'll say, this depiction is problematic or that depiction is problematic, and they'll be correct. But I would love for the conversation, and sometimes the students are able to are the ones able to do this, to make the conversation more complicated about how do you have a character behave badly, and then also say, like, that the book isn't condoning that. And then is it even a book's job to pass judgment in that way?
Right. I mean, I know, I think we're, these are conversations that have always existed, and that since the beginning of literature, but I certainly think we're in a moment much more than when I was young, where people feel powerfully the political power of fiction, right, and the political engagement of fiction, and I'm always trying to just I believe that all fiction is political. I also believe, and I try to tell him, that Chekhov line, it's not my job to tell you that horse thieves are bad people. It's my job to tell you what this horse thief is like, right? That it's that actually that to give the reader the agency and the freedom to make a decision for themselves about a character or a situation. That's actually the writer's job, is to sort of to illuminate, to observe as closely as possible without passing judgment. And I think, this idea that I do worry about the idea that characters should be exemplars in some way, and should show us how to think or how to feel, rather than characters should be just people. I'm somebody who's really believes that characters should be just people, and then the reader takes whatever they're going to take from that, and hopefully if you observe well, they take what you want them to. But the minute you try to force them, I feel like your fiction's going to be in trouble.
And I've got this idea that I'm trying to develop, and it's not completely articulated even in the questions that we wrote for the podcast, that I feel like when a society is healthy and operational, that individual peoples and families have the space and time and lack of fear to chronicle their own history, and that their private lives become the news that is brought then out to the world. And that I have felt like the society that I'm living in for the last 3 years, and maybe longer than that, I can even, especially during the war, I mean, I wrote about the war in Iraq, isn't really healthy. And so I felt a lot less willing to pay attention to that private news, and it seems like the message that what Trump is asking Americans to do is replace him, put him in the place of that private news, right? His story, his facts, his election fraud, whatever, his story is that's happening then, is what you should be following, instead of the narrative of your own life, Does that ring a bell to you? Does that seem accurate?
Yes, totally. And I mean, the number of times I felt that I have moved into a dysfunctional family with a tyrannical, addicted and addictive patriarch, right? Abusive patriarch. That's, who's going to make sure that, your whole life stops to revolve around this head of the household. It seems it, but I think you're right too, that wouldn't have been possible. He wouldn't have been able to do that if he wouldn't have been elected, if we hadn't been in a state of dysfunction as a society already. I really think that's true. And I think there are all kinds of reasons why that's so. And how long have we got? Like, I could give you my like hour-long sort of rant about all the things that I think are feed into this. But what I would say is that I think that the lack of respect for the dignity of a small private life is a real problem, right? In our culture at the moment, that has to do with so many things, including paradoxically the privileging of, we're the society where everybody's an individual, but we have so privileged the individual over the collective, right? That we're always looking, that an individual has to stand out in some way, to be a celebrity or a millionaire or whatever, to be worthwhile. And I don't think that was true in my parents' generation. I don't think that was true really when I was young, or maybe just beginning. And I think social media, first television, but then social media, those things feed it, right? So we spend our time looking at the pictures of other people's lives, thinking, because those people have chosen really nice pictures, that their lives must be better than ours are.
I guess, Sugi, and I'm curious to know what how your family drew up its narratives. Claire, there's so much about your family in this essay collection, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go on. But I remember, my family has lived in Kansas City since like the 1890s. So there's been a lot of stability that other people don't always get to have. And that gives us a certain sense of, space and the ability to have these sort of memories. But there was a sense prior really to the internet of my family spent a lot of time talking about itself, right? Writing. My grandfather painted pictures of the kids in the family, and I have like a hand painted like list of everybody's birthday and what was happening within the family and in the private space of just this city. We didn't really think about anything outside of it, was sort of self-sufficient for a lifetime. I think for my grandparents probably. And I feel like that's gotten a little lost, at least for me and my generation, in part because I got too much stuff to do.
It was interesting to see Sri Lanka appear in this collection. My family is Sri Lankan. And so I think also, right, I come from a non-patrilineal family structure. So even just I can't really use names. Like a house in my family burned in 1983. And so a lot of photos were gone. And I think that it has produced a generation of people, probably my generation, who are obsessively collecting whatever they can collect because they think it's possibly, it's at risk. What isn't at risk? And so anytime you find, so it creates a kind of information hoarding, I think. Like my desktop is a nightmare. But it's such a beautiful mess, and I'm so glad to have what I have. But certainly it's a lot messier than I think what a lot of other people have.
Claire, you were going to say something, and I wanted to remind you to say it.
I was just going to say that I feel like, to my, what I was saying earlier about the loss of a sense of the dignity of a small life. I'm a huge believer in letter writing, which comes back to this issue of the stories that our families tell ourselves. I'm the child of not my dad, he never wrote letters, but my grandparents wrote letters, and my mother wrote tons of letters. When I was in college, she wrote to me 3 times a week. And I wrote letters. I wrote tons of, I never do. I'm the person who writes the email or that text that goes on like 3 different, and people are like, oh, doesn't she know how to text? But I just think that record of personal communication, right, between, not for public consumption, but between 2 people directly addressed, from one person to another, is such a particular way of telling the stories of our lives, right? And everybody had access to that when that was a form of communication.
And I feel like you can see that even drifting out of literature in the way that, I mean, I remember as a kid loving epistolary novels. I mean, I remember reading like Daddy Longlegs or like the sections of like Ella Montgomery books that were letters between little girls who were friends. Or, I mean, any one of a number of books that were in that form. And then now I think also of, several years ago, I read Neil Gordon's book about the Weather Underground. Oh my goodness, the title is escaping my memory. Is it The Company You Keep? But it was in the form of emails, and it was right after sort of people had started using email, and there were these really long emails. The book is in the form of really long emails, and I assigned it to some of my students. I thought it was, totally normal, and I assigned it to some of my students, and they were like, "Sugi, no." I was like, "Why not?" They were like, "No one writes emails this long. This is not realistic." And I felt so sad that they didn't have that. And then I also felt, of course, antiquated and obsolete.
Well, and now my kids, like, when I say send an email to so and so, they're like, email? What? I know they don't email. That's too slow. It's too old. It's too wordy.
So like the most recent form of popular epistolary novel is my colleague Julie Schumacher's Dear Committee Members.
Which is wonderful. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think if I'm remembering right, Claire, you have an ancestor who wrote like a 1,500-page book on like the family that he only intended his family to read. So, I mean, that seems like that level of interior attention is that's quite a long email that would have been.
Totally. Yeah. Well, but thinking of all the lost, Sugi talking about, what the photographs being lost, like he stuck the photographs in there and the telegrams and like some menus from restaurants and, bills from hotels. And I mean, it's the whole thing. And I feel like when I read it for the first, fully, I'd read bits before, but I was on leave from teaching and I spent a semester reading it and a couple years ago. And it was just incredible. I felt like my grandparents were totally present and alive to me in all their complexity. It was amazing.
We encourage our listeners to pick up Kant's Little Prussian Head and Other Reasons Why I Write. It's been really a joy to talk to you today.
And a joy to talk to you both. Thank you, Whitney. Thank you, Sugi. Thank you.
Thank you very much.